So I have the pleasure of introducing our closing keynote speaker, Ned Dodington from Expanded Environment. Just to say a few words about Ned before he gets started. He is a licensed architect and designer working to develop new practices for biologically inclusive design. Ned is the founding editor and creative director of the Expanded Environment, a web-based investigation into the performative role of design in ecology. His design research and writings have been published in Architectural Design Magazine, Bracket Journal, Arts and Culture Magazine, and also shown in solo and group shows at the Lawndale Art Center, Houston, Russ Pittman Park, and in Minnesota. He has also been an invited speaker at numerous organizations and institutions, and was a featured presenter at TEDx Houston in 2013. And so he'll be speaking more about his work in the following talk. So welcome, Ned, and thank you for coming.
Yeah. Thanks for that great introduction, and really it's been a pleasure to be here. It's been a really great conference, and thanks to Sue for inviting me. It's really been an amazing group of people and great discussion, though I recognize I've only been here for, I missed like 2/3 of the conference. I apologize for that. But I'll try to make up for it a little bit today. I'll admit I sort of struggled with kind of how to frame exactly what it was I was going to talk to you guys about tonight. And sort of quickly I had kind of submitted to Sue that I talk about architecture as interspecies interlocutor. So that will be kind of the front of the talk, and then we'll move into a little bit about what the expanded environment does. Maybe I have that backwards. Maybe let's do expanded environment stuff first, then we'll do interlocutor. And then I'll look at, just sort of briefly, if there's time, sort of show kind of what I do sort of personally to try to work in this field. Though obviously you've seen a lot of this work from others in the conference. So just a quick plug for the organization here. You're looking at the landing page of the Expanded Environment. It's a website. There is a paywall. You got to pay the bill somehow, right? So it's a nonprofit organization. All the money through the paywall goes to pay hosting fees, put on art shows, cover incidentals, things like that. It's not going to lobster and steak dinners for myself and my wife. I promise you that. But I will, if anyone's interested in just getting it free, give me your business card or your email address, and I'll just sign you up for free. I'll also add you to our kind of semi-regular mailing distribution. So anyway, if you have an interest in that, just get in touch with me. I'm happy to add you to the website. So basically, just for those who are interested in what the website offers, I mean, we talk about what's going on in the design world in terms of how architects and designers can start to include animal life and ecology in their designs. And I'll just briefly point out this kind of search technique here, where if you're interested in a particular way, ideology that an animal behaves or exists in the world, you can kind of organize the information by that filter. So you can start looking at sort of insect projects or avian projects or bat projects, and some of this is sourced by myself and the other editors, some of it's direct projects that are given to us, and we also talk about our competition. So I'm sort of jumped ahead of my agenda here, but I thought it would be best to kind of talk a little bit about the organization first. And so the title of today's talk is From Across the Divide, Architecture as Cross-Species Interlocutor. And that, so we already sort of went through this, you all understand what the website is now. The cross-species interlocutor kind of gets at, in a way, the kind of mission transition that happened when we went from animal architecture to the expanded environment. Some of you might have seen this website as animal architecture. And I'll touch on that in a second. The general guiding impetus for this entire project is to kind of get outside of anthropocentric or anthropogenic, anthropo, whatever you want to say, kind of impetuses in design. How do you get beyond yourself, beyond your own condition, and start to consider other non-human life? It's a big, big challenge, right? It may be arguably sort of impossible. We'll get to that in a second. It's also about recognizing architecture and design as a very sort of manifest, sort of humanist exercise. In a way, sort of building or sort of making 3 dimensions, the sort of policy and sort of socially organized practices that we legislate to sort of say who lives in a house, who doesn't live in a house, whether it's okay to keep an animal, not to keep an animal. That architecture sort of stands in as this sort of way of mediating life, mediating human and non-human life. It's a sort of built manifestation of those rules and legislations. So expanded environment is trying to sort of bring that to the fore. The website is also about recognizing the kind of spatial implications and sort of behavioral patterns that non-human life already bring with them, right? So all of these organisms have a kind of form or sort of way of engaging in the world already sort of part of their being. So 2 different examples. We have the very famous swarming patterns of swallows, and they're kind of the beautiful flowingness of that sort of aggregate sort of phenomenon versus a very sort of simple diagram of how a cow detects danger in a sort of peripheral view, and then also how it likes to sort of meander in a generally sort of curved path. So what this is kind of getting at is as we start to look at designing with or for animals or other ecological patterns, you don't have to go too far to sort of start to see shape and form show up in these beings. So again, that's kind of long introduction again to what the expanded environment is sort of set up to try to discuss. Our most successful tool for bringing these conversations to the public is through our annual, semi-annual, we skipped a few years, competition series. So we have the Animal Architecture, now the Expanded Environment Awards. We did one in 2011, then in 12, and then most recently in 2015. And this is just a call for work. It's international. We basically what I do is to be honest, I invent a competition, and I work with the team to develop a theme. We invite the most famous people we can think of to be on the jury. We get people like Joyce to help us out, and then we distribute posters, and we post it on Archinect, on Building Blog, on Bustler. We give it to all the schools we can think of, and we sort of see what comes in the door. And then we have the very famous jury look at it and sort of assess whether or not we have some winners here. It's been really interesting, and it's something we continue to do. And it's the bulk of the content on the expanded environment. And so, over the 7 years that I've been sort of managing the website, only the last 2 as the expanded environment, but we have somewhere close to 200 projects that more or less fit this kind of conversation about how do architects and designers mediate the sort of human and non-human world. I will say just right up front that Joyce is a big figure on the website, so she has not paid me to say that, and there's no transaction here, but we do find Joyce's work to be particularly successful, and I'm not alone in that, obviously. So let's get back a little bit again to this topic, which I seem to be avoiding. And this ties back to what I said was kind of a shift in the organization away from animal architecture to the expanded environment. And that is we, after about 5 or 6 years of sort of thinking about animals and working with animals, the term, the topic, the name, animal is always very uncomfortable to me. I mean, a lot of this is about recognizing also that humans are animals. And also the phrase nature, I find very problematic for a lot of reasons. And so we decided that we're going to broaden the scope, and it's not just about animals. And we're going to think maybe even more broadly about animalness and what it means to be an animal, whether we're a human or a bird or a raccoon. Sounds like it's a great life as a raccoon in Toronto, by the way. that this would be a larger conversation about how to live sort of in a built environment. And that environment would also be sort of enlarged or broadened, and sort of allow designers and allow humans to take sort of ownership of interventions in the environment that is sort of both engineered and sort of ecologically responsible. I think there's a hang-up that we get into if we think that if we do something, it's going to be detrimental in a way, that building anything is bad. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. And we can build things that are actually better for the environment. I mean, that you can sort of bioengineer ecosystems to be more productive, right? And so we have to give ourselves that permission, I think, to think about ecology and architecture in a very, very active way. But the interlocutor is a kind of Uexküllian idea, and there's a lot of Uexküll going around here, which is great, because for a long time I thought I was the only one who thought Uexküll was up to anything. So the idea is that I'm all over the place on these slides. I apologize. I'll just quickly mention here. We'll get to Uexküll in a second. So the idea is that these are some of the cities of the future. You know, we mentioned that the global population is booming. Most of it's going to happen in urban areas and cities that don't yet exist. This is an image from a city, an anonymous city in China. I forget what it is, but it's this sort of unending perspective of exactly the same house. And you can see that someone like Gates, you know, if there's one problem with one of these houses, he's going to have a million different opportunities here. So this is one of these sort of problems that we are currently in. And then really what we're talking about with the sort of starting to get at the interspecies interlocutor is that, you know, animals already exist in these worlds, right? We mentioned that the raccoon is doing really well in Toronto. And the problem is that our built forms don't know how to deal with that. And if the built form is really the sort of manifestation of these kind of human ideas, and if humans are also animals, we need to sort of thicken the form in a way, so sort of make it more robust, more usable. And this is a fantastic Uexküllian example that really the best one I can come up with. You know, Uexküll talks about his the famous The Life of the Tick, right? That sort of, its Umwelt is very specific, and it just drops off on a branch when it feels heat and butyric acid. But he also goes into this description of the spider web, and the spider web being the spider's way of manifesting the behavior of a fly, because the spider is really interested in trapping a fly. So it's going to design a web to catch a fly. So the web, in a sense, in an Uexküllian sense, is the intersection of spider space and fly space. It's the manifest object where these two umwelts collide. You have the spider umwelt of the web and the sort of, you know, its desire to sort of eat food, and then you have the sort of the fly umwelt of not being able to see the web and having it sort of, you know, be ensnared by the spider. And if the spider were trying to catch elephants, the web would look very different, we would think. Otherwise, you'd have a lot of hungry spiders, I guess. So this was the kind of the entree to objects and architecture being able to cross umwelts and interspecies worlds. So it allows us, I think, to get outside of trying to design specifically for an umwelt, and allowing the sort of the neutralness of some objects to become that bridge. And I don't know if I'm going out on a limb here. I should mention I don't have a degree in philosophy. This is all very kind of, you know, amateur in the best sense that I love to read this stuff. But this is, I think, where we're going a little bit more, where I'd like to see this go, as sort of looking at objects, and thinkers like Tim Norton and Kerry Wolf kind of carry this thinking a little bit further. And, you know, I'm sure we can all think of other examples of this where, you know, the space is reappropriated by animal use, or you sort of start to see these two umwelts collide. This is just really quick. I was thinking about, you know, artificial reefs made out of rejected train cars. And so this is a subway car that's been decommissioned and turned into an artificial reef. So maybe you have the overlapping of sort of human space now in a fish world. Or a nice sort of maybe more poetic idea about sort of birds using bell towers for hunting or sort of just perching areas. Actually, I think some of Sarah's early mappings of rooftops for peregrine falcons, and that would be a sort of like a nice Uxkillian overlap where the roof plateau is good for human shelter, but it's also now a nice sort of hunting ground for falcons in urban conditions. So all of this is sort of already existing, but we're not really kind of talking about it, and it's also, in a way, not very productive. I mean, it's accidental. And so what we're trying to get at is, how do you do more of this? How do you do it more specifically? How do you make it better? How do you design in a way that allows for more umwelt to exist in an object? Is this making any sense? I mean, okay, good. Couldn't really tell. Okay, so this is, now we're back to the expanded environment, and this is the kind of question we're trying to resolve. Again, I don't have any real answers here, but this is sort of what other people are trying to sort of submit to the website. And it runs the range of projects. I'll say most of the projects are student-based. We do get some professionals. So what we'll talk about now is kind of a broad overview of what's on the expanded environment. And in a way, it sort of breaks down into 3 categories. And they're basically overgeneralizations, but for the most part, we have a series of synanthropic installations of some kind. There's this philosophy of like, okay, we need to live in closer proximity with wildlife or other animals, and so we're going to build for that kind of purpose. The second would be a more sort of landscape approach, which is more along the lines of the bridges that we talked about earlier today. How do you sort of integrate pathways and sort of urban crossings in a sort of urban area? And then the third is what I call post-animal projects, and that's the kind of art installation. It's more of a kind of PR approach to changing human attitudes about non-human life. So, just sort of start with synanthropic habitats. And all of these projects I just kind of cherry-picked off the website. But this is a bird skyscraper by a student situated above Central Park. He wants to capitalize on the sort of the water resource at Central Park as an attractor for birds. And so he thinks this would be a great place to put this kind of nesty-shaped bird aggregating kind of guano collecting skyscraper. And so one example of how you might sort of produce a sort of synanthropic habitat in an urban area. A smaller sort of case study intervention would be these kind of bird blocks or branches that could make building facades more acceptable to non-human use. I mean, imagine, I don't know, maybe the wildlife removal guys are shaking their heads at this situation, but it could be quite acceptable. There actually are some brick products that have holes in them pre-made for nesting birds. So you can have a portion of your building facade actually, livable for roosting birds. I think that's a nice Umweltian overlap, right? So this is akin to maybe what Joyce showed on Friday. There are bat towers. Bat seems to be a pretty prominent species in these conversations. This one's at the edge of a park, not necessarily a typically urban context, but the design of it is sort of taking into consideration the movement of the spiraling pattern of the bat in and out of its roosting area. Here's Joyce, one of Joyce's project with her classmates, a bat cloud scenario suspended in a forest. So these kind of suspended aggregating food devices for bat habitation. Really, really cool. More Joyce. Beehive tower on an urban location for a relocated beehive. And I won't speak for Joyce. If we have questions, we can ask Joyce about it later, but this was a very successful project and became a marketing tool for the guys that own the property. a butterfly installation inside of a kind of collective sewing facility in Mexico. So this is a room that employs a lot of women doing sort of menial labor tasks. You can kind of see them over here in the corner. And the owners understood that if you invited natural light and plantings and butterflies, the productivity would go up and people would be happy and they would enjoy their lives. And so they built these kind of pockets in the wall for plants that then attracted butterflies. So you have butterflies indoors. It's nice. It's in Mexico. You can work outside for most of the year. You know, it's open to butterflies. Would maybe be difficult in Toronto, possibly. These are becoming way more prevalent, right? And some of the stuff you can actually purchase pretty easily on things like Etsy, or these are basically sort of urban hedgerows. These are bug attracting, art installations that are used to. I mean, they're beautiful to look at. It's collections of bark and twigs and leaves and whatnot, sort of designed to attract bugs. I think particularly interesting in the UK scenario that has maybe a challenge maintaining an insect population. So this is a great, not very intrusive, probably pretty low dollar way of engaging sort of animal life into your patio or your outdoor scenario. Soft systems is the second kind of category that I talked about or mentioned. The more sort of landscape approach, the kind of projects that come to us for engaging animal life. These are sort of, this is a museum, sort of museum proposal that acts as a land bridge across a ravine for wildlife. So kind of, again, doubling up the kind of the human use with the animal use. This is an international student project where the exhibitions sort of mirror the kind of life that's going on or match up with what's going on across the ravine. This was a really interesting sort of boardwalk out into a tidal zone from a student in, I think the UK, where the boardwalk is this kind of porous cement kind of system that involves a sort of slightly off-kilter sort of disc here that sort of loosely sits in these pockets that then collects seawater when the tide goes down, and so you still get a lot of the little microbes and bugs and organisms that would normally be in sort of the nooks and crannies of the other sort of areas here. So it's okay to walk on it, but it's still maintaining life. So just a kind of a really interesting overlapping of sort of human and animal functions. This one's a little bit more fun, a little bit more kind of pie in the sky, about using decommissioned old sort of tankers and aircraft carriers for agriculture on the sea. Could it work? Maybe. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, an interesting overlap. I mean, if agricultural land is becoming scarce and we need to produce more food, maybe putting it out to sea makes sense. It has this kind of water world feel to it. So, with global change and climate change, maybe we need to move Iowa out into the Atlantic. Maybe this is the way to do it. So anyway, I mean, so you kind of get the sense. These are the largest. This is from the most recent competition, Walk into the Sea, which was a project for Boston's Harbor about sort of mitigating climate change and sea level rise. And it's a very involved landscape project that probably is a little bit too much detail to go into right now. But I mean, you kind of get the sense that these are the kind of larger scale installation or proposals that come across our sort of desk. The most fun for me to talk about are the post-animal projects, and these are, again, I mentioned the kind of the PR, pull at the heartstrings, kind of change your perspective about animal life and non-human life. And some, like this guy, Simone, actually suggest more or less putting on virtual reality Oakskill goggles to try to put the user into the world of a pigeon or of a bat, and sort of changing the human perception to actually match that of the animal in question. And this proposal was for a video game that they're going to make, so you start out as a fairly low-level animal, And the better you sort of navigate the low-level animal world, you sort of progress up the food chain and sort of evolve, I guess, to a more higher sense organism. Maybe this is treading on dangerous territory, I don't know. Anyway, this was actually the winner of the first year, and was a kind of contentious project among the jury. A lot of people thought, like, well, this isn't architecture, this isn't design, like, this is just complete, in mind games, why would we do this? But eventually, it rose to the top, and I think it's a great project. We did feature this project, which I think I've seen on some other slides here, Farmland World by Hicks and Neumeier in Chicago. This is their thinking in the future about what happens if all of our agriculture gets mechanized and you no longer need to slaughter actual animals for meat. If it's produced in sort of the tissue culture kind of meat stuff, or if we're all eating soy at that point, that maybe the livestock and rodeo show, which is a big event in Houston, would become a sort of just now we're just looking at cows grazing, because that's the novelty, right? That there used to be this thing called a cow that we used to consume, and it used to just kind of do this in the field. Because now we have these huge robo-chickens and robo-cows to actually produce the food. So, I love this stuff. It's so, there's a sense of humor to it. There's a sense of wonder. This one was an entry for this year's competition. This year's competition, by the way, was called Monster. So the first year was animal. I think it was just animal architecture. We asked for anyone to submit any project that involved an animal whatsoever, and we take it. The second year we focused on urban animals, so we wanted it to be a sort of urban context. And this third one, sort of paralleling the shift to expanded environment, we enlarged the call to be monster. And monster, I don't know if that's come up in any of these talks this week, but monster is a really interesting condition where you have these sort of strange overlaps and combinations of living, sometimes non-living, or sort of multiple things coexisting together to create this sort of strange other. And so we took that as our theme. And so this was a kind of strange melange of programmatic elements sort of forced together into an architectural school project. This guy was another student, but kind of sort of stretching sort of programmatic elements in an architectural academic setting to create a new sort of monstrous experience. Interesting. It was a little bit off the radar for us typically, but the jury responded to it well. This one is this was the winner of the monster competition. It's called Weather Species, and this young woman completely redefined architecture. So I kind of started saying that architecture was a way that we've typically divided human and non-human life. And she starts off by saying that architecture really just protects us from the weather. And it's mostly just a kind of environmental enclosure. And because of that, we can look at other devices to protect us from the weather. It doesn't have to be necessarily enclosure. And so she created a whole bunch of different kind of devices for mediating atmospheric and weather conditions, and sort of created them as species. So it's a new sort of robotic, interactive way of mediating sort of environmental conditions to this human experience. And it was really interesting and thought-provoking sort of submission. Also beautiful, beautiful drawings. I think this is the last one of the projects I'll show. How am I doing on time, by the way? No one's watching me. I can go dangerously long on these things. So this was a really interesting project as well called In Praise of Dust. It becomes a little hard to see, but this is a kind of, this student did a series of installations on sort of architecturally dust collecting ornamentation. And his point of departure was that dust and the microbes that live inside of it have kind of always been sort of part of sort of life, right? In the history of sort of disease and miasma and sort the transmission of disease has an interesting history as well. And he's kind of drawn that history through these kind of cornice and molding kind of installation parts that actually are designed to amplify and show the presence of dust more. So just a really kind of, putting the microbes on display was, I think, a really interesting idea. So yeah, so that was so that's, again, the kind of the Herculean exercise that is kind of being produced on the expanded environment. And so I hope you guys find it interesting. Some of it runs the range. I mean, we saw projects like the birds in the inhabitable bricks, from the very practical and to the kind of embrace of dust, or the weather species installation is completely fanciful. So I think it's a great range and a good way to start the conversation. I'll talk briefly now about kind of how I kind of put on this other hat of trying to do some of the work also myself. I guess I get a little jealous of everyone else doing the work, and so I want to kind of sort of step into the field a little bit too. And so I've had kind of multiple ways of engaging this. I'll talk about three. They've all been sort of installations in sort of gallery settings. And always I think a thread through my work is about trying to let the non-human sort of form and life come to the fore. That I'm very, very sensitive about trying to control the natural, the quote, natural stuff too much. And so I really like forefronting that kind of, those kind of accidents, the kind of uncontrollability of sort of these other systems. So this is a picture, an early sort of prototype for an installation I created at a gallery called Lawndale. And basically you're looking at women's stockings that are filled with grass seed and sod, and then fed with an IV drip of Miracle Grow from above. And so basically the idea was to create a kind of suspended garden in an interior space, a very small interior space, and to allow these kind of the sense of being in the earth, being sort of surrounded by sod and the sort of the dampness and the kind of the peatiness or the smell of the grass to kind of really permeate the space and sort of walk inside of it. So this is like a workshop that I worked out of for a little while, and kind of prototyping these things, trying to figure out how to suspend them with different sort of hanging apparatuses. And this is the installation inside the gallery, where we've mounted a couple dozen of these things in the ceiling. This is the kind of the promo photo of these things in sort of full bloom. So the idea was that what's really on display is the grass. And I kind of wanted to forefront the artificiality of all of this. The grass is not any particular sort of variety of grass. It's whatever you can buy at Home Depot for the sort of the least amount of money. It's genetically modified. It's hyper artificial, right? It's the whole thing sort of speaks about artificiality, while yet being kind of alive and growing and sort of quote natural. Anyway, so that was kind of my first foray into this kind of work. That was followed by a research project that was funded by the Rice Design Alliance, where I did my graduate work. And I came across this. I was very interested in sort of urban behavior in urban settings. And I came across an Audubon survey, Audubon Society of Houston, that reported no birds in downtown Houston, like zero birds in downtown Houston, which I thought was funny because I was living in downtown at the time, and there were birds on my balcony every day, and they were mostly pigeons, but birds nonetheless, pigeons and sparrows. And the question was really like, is it that there are no birds in downtown? Or are there no people counting them? Or are the birds that people are counting sort of viewed by the Audubon Society as not really worth paying attention to? And that was the kind of sort of the premise of the research grant, was to figure out sort of exactly what was going on, and then to maybe provide an answer. And we did our own. So this is my kind of foray into sort of urban ecological mapping. And we kind of sectioned off downtown Houston. By the way, if you're not familiar, this is the general sort of contour of downtown Houston. It's completely encircled by highways, lots of cars going really fast. There's a sort of a dense organization of skyscrapers in this area, but then you get these kind of bombed out surface parking lot areas that surround a lot of the downtown. You get more residential areas sort of on this side, and over here we were talking about the Third Ward earlier, where there's a lot of nice activity going on now. But so this is the basic contour of Houston, and we gridded it off and walked the city. And we tried to observe birds, and if we couldn't observe birds, we tried to observe places where they would, likely or hopefully be found. So that was, green areas, any type of greenery, be it a tree or a shrub or a bush, water sources, food sources, all of this stuff. We just kind of took notes on our notepads. By the way, we did this in like July or August, which is really not the time to do any kind of outdoor surveying in Houston. Just saying. And we created this kind of heat map, sort of heat maps of potential bird watching locations, I guess you could say, or likely bird intersections. That areas that were green. So the pinker the area. So these kind of pink along the streets are actually mapping street trees. So it's not that the street itself is good for birds, but that there's a nice corridor of live oaks or some other kind of maple or a street tree on that street. We then started looking at sort of bird types and etiologies in the sort of urban area. Just through observation and also through talking to other bird watchers, we were able to find that yes, indeed, there were very many birds in downtown Houston, and they ranged from your typical, pigeon to some peregrine falcons. We have some cattle egrets and black-crowned herons. Really a pretty interesting group, and this sort of then begot a series of design interventions. So once we understood that, in fact, it was more or less due to a lack of observation, we thought what we want to do is to now incentivize urban bird watching. Now this is sort of saying that there are birds already there, we just need to kind of put the bird experience more to the fore. And so this was a kind of series of hypothetical design interventions for the urban area about where you might sort of like engage in sort of urban bird watching. Like for example, we're trying to put a nice installation in for a heron, or maybe this is the robin kind of bird watching scenario on a lamppost, or this kind of grassy, greeny sort of light infrastructure on a porch. So that was kind of where this grant wrapped up, and we were invited to then actually sort of build a few of these and install them in a park setting, which wasn't really the ideal scenario since we were sort of geared on urban stuff. But we said sure, okay, and we started to think about what kind of birds were in the park, and then apply some of that thinking to sort of new kinds of bird perches or bird sort of observation roosts that could be suspended inside the park. So these are some kind of fabrication shots. We're back actually in that same workspace. And then we installed them in a series of locations in this local park. Some of them had birdseed in them, some of them didn't. Some of them had this kind of colored film to more or less attract human observation, not necessarily bird. Oops, I guess that's the last image. That was the built idea there. And finally, we're moving right along here. This is the last sort of version of this exploration into working with animals. And it's a 6-month installation at this art gallery, Lawndale, in their backyard court here. And really we wanted to kind of take a shot at designing for an entire little ecosystem, to use the backyard, almost kind of harkening back to that first installation of the grass growing out of the stockings. It was sort of like, how would you make a sort of stocking apparatus for insects, birds, other sort of mammals? Like, how do you sort of register the presence of life against the kind of built structure? And so we started working with grids, basically, and kind of developed a theory that you could sort of subdivide a grid to make it more acceptable for some types of life versus others. You could deploy these grids across a certain sort of season, and with, combined with sort of plantings, you could start to arrive at kind of engineered or installed sort of attractors, bioattractors for different type of life. And that's a theory anyway. So we've just kind of started the installation process, actually just like 2 weeks ago. These are some early renderings of the idea. That it's sort of like a Sol-LeWitt sculpture meets urban hedgerow idea. The idea again about the grid, about the cube, is that same idea about letting the form register difference. Building something that the cube is usually a pretty human shape, right? Cubes don't normally pop up in the natural world that often. I mean, it's sure like salt crystals. I mean, you get down to sort of smaller crystalline structures. Okay, you start to see cubes, but you don't usually see other animals making cubic structures. So using that as a fairly sort of a neutral anthropomorphic form that then sort of the presence of their life can sort of react against, we thought was a pretty good strategy, rather than trying to sort of design for, okay, this is going to be the beehive section, and we have to make it look like a beehive. Of course, we could be sort of proven wrong by a lot of this. I will say we are working with a biologist on the team, and she's trying to keep us even, so there is a little bit of legitimacy to this, I think. And we're also working with a botanist to help us choose the right plants, to make sure we're getting the right type of butterfly attracting plants for the butterflies we want, and sort of insects, drought-resistant plants, of course. We're also going totally native for those kind of nativists in the room. These are some production kind of drawings for how the cube might be assembled. This was a kind of an elevational study about how these things might be put together. The whole thing was CNC fabricated by, frankly, I did a lot of it, but we also had help from a local fabrication company. Due to budget constraints, we went for half a cube instead of a full cube, so it ended up being kind of a triangle instead of a square. Again, if you guys sign up for that registration, you'll help the project come together. This is, we did specifically want to include a chimney swift tower. Chimney swifts have become a sort of an obsession of mine recently as a pretty interesting sort of synanthropic species that has really cohabitated well, I think, in a lot of situations with human development. And so we wanted to at least symbolically invite chimney swifts to this installation. So working again with the Audubon Society, they do sort of return my calls now and then. We came up with a sort of chimney swift tower. Modularity, I should mention, was also a really big component of this for us, that each cube we wanted to engineer some flexibility into the system to say, like, well, if this whole triangle shape doesn't really work out, we can kind of take the thing apart and redistribute it. And so modularity was a big part, that trying to allow ourselves to fail or to sort of re-engineer the thing in month 3, when nobody showed up and the place is populated by wasps or something, that we can kind of start over a little bit or reorganize it. Because again, we don't really know. Oh, and I should also mention at this point, we're working with a computer science student, or professor, at the University of Houston, who's coming up with motion sensors and sort of temperature, humidity, sun and shade sensors for this installation. To try not only really to kind of monitor bioactivity on the site. We had an idea that could kind of work into the art display of it, that if it became really popular with, if you had chimney swifts going in and out of this thing all day long, that the kind of motion of the chimney swift as it's registered by these sensors could become a kind of abstract digital art display inside the gallery. We're not quite there yet, but it's something we're trying to work towards. So this was the kind of final rendering of the thing for the proposal. And this is sort of as it stands in sort of the first half of phase 1. So again, we're sort of slowly building this thing over 6 months. The next phase is going to be to complete we're going to complete the wood structure almost immediately, actually, and then start planting it in early March. And then we're going to kind of sit back and sort of see what happens. And hopefully we're surprised by a lot of things. Hopefully we really get some things that we didn't expect. And hopefully we also get some things that we did expect to sort of show that we were on the right track. So I think this is kind of where I land. So really just kind of in conclusion, we're interested, and it's really great to sort of see all of the other work that's going on in terms of kind of crossing these sort of human and non-human worlds. And I will just sort of make one last reminder that I think our built worlds can be this sort of threshold at which these conversations, these interworlding, Umweltian conversations can exist, and really just push for more thought and more consideration in the sort of structures and the built environments that we have some control over to allow those other worlds to exist. So with that, visit the website, check it out, and keep doing great work.
You've given us a lot to think about, Ned. We're going to open the floor to questions, and mindful that you want to leave at 6:45 to catch your plane.
Plenty of time.
I think we're all right.
Go for an hour. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how much consulting do you do with biologists to determine the ecological impact of the designs that you showed there?
Like my designs, or?
Yeah, well, yeah.
So we work with, for particularly the last installation, the biologist. So I guess, what do you mean in terms of ecological impact?
Like in terms of the structure and if it will affect the species in a certain way, perhaps.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. The structure.
The structure itself, and not just consulting the biologist to determine what to put in it.
So the biologists had a lot of input in terms of what we should kind of target in terms of species. So, I guess I didn't really mention the design, spaces that are in this. So it's a 3-foot cubic module. The interior dimension, clear space in here is 1'6", which is, we were told from the Audubon Society, was the minimum allowable distance for a chimney swift tower. So for whatever reason, you can't have a chimney swift tower be narrower than 1.5 feet. Also, you have to use a particular kind of siding material when going after chimney swifts. Chimney swifts have a really hard time perching on branches and things. They have to sort of grab onto the side of a rough surface. I guess we were making this out of brick and sort of mortar. They sort of latch onto the bricky kind of mortar ledges. Since this is more or less plywood, you have to use a particular kind of 111 plywood. So the aperture of this kind of drove the overall dimension of the cube. The subdivisions inside, like these kind of slats, are designed to sort of work with a bee or butterfly occupation strategy. So the idea is that plants will exist on this register on the ground. Up above them, in this sort of second level, we can infill with things like twigs, bark, branches, more like the urban hedgerow strategy of before. So the idea being that the smaller the aperture, the tighter the pack of the infill of sort of twigs and debris, and thereby the different organism that you get with that sort of environment. So again, the biologist has advice on the kind of bark you choose, the openings, is that 2 inches, 3 inches, or 4 inches, or 5 inches, 6 inches, kind of. So that's where she comes in and helps us make those decisions. So, was that saying what you were asking?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Okay, great.
I'm just wondering, I didn't catch this, but what was your motivation in designing something that sort of like focalizes and like a massive variety of ecological interactions?
Yeah. it was just casting a wide net. I mean, I think we wanted, I really like the idea of this kind of cyclical, self-sustaining sort of system that like the plants bring the insects, that bring the birds kind of deal, but then bring the people, that maybe bring more plants, that bring more insects, that bring birds, I love that kind of cyclical food web kind of aspect. It's something I think that it's very aspirational. I don't know if it's actually really going to pan out that way, but I love that kind of sort of positive feedback loop that happens in a kind of productive ecosystem area. Understanding that you are actually inviting insects to be eaten by birds. I mean, like, I get that. And maybe that's too bad for the insects, but it's pretty good for the birds. So you have to sort of pick some battles here. It seemed a little bit more fruitful to try to get a broader range of activity than to go, say, like straight for chimney swifts. Maybe again, you might be proven wrong by that, but.
Well, I was more thinking like, even if you're concerned with the same ecological interactions between the different species, and using the same amount of huge shaped things, if they were sort of distributed differently instead of being all clumped together,
Okay.
whether or not it would facilitate the ecological interactions between them, like
Yeah.
whether or not like that focalizing versus
Sure.
it was part of the design
Sure.
consideration.
It was. At one point, in early, so this thing has gone through a bunch of different design iterations. The first application actually was a sort of dispersed kind of field of these cubes out on the land. And I forget the conversation. I think we wanted it to be more of a sort of sculptural piece. And that was kind of driving basically sort of the human interaction with it. Yeah, that it would be this sort of like more or less an object that the visitor, the person who goes to the gallery, is looking to interact with something, and so that this would be a piece for them to sort of stand against and witness. But we may be, again, that's part kind of going back to the modularity aspect. We might find that this will work in a different arrangement. And so I think we were aware of that, trying to build it, that it could be sort of picked up and moved around. So, good question.
Thanks, Ned. It's great to see what you're doing. I envy you having such a kind of umbrella of fascinating projects to curate in that way. I'm just interested if you could say a bit more about this term post-animal.
Yeah.
Is that just a kind of chronological thing in terms of your own thought development, or is it a kind of ontological statement about being beyond the animal or other than the animal?
Yes.
The latter?
Both.
Okay.
So Kerry Wolf, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. So Kerry is a friend of mine. He's chair of the English department at Rice. And taking I sort of stumbled into his class during my graduate program, and it really changed my life. It was a really amazing program, and he does a lot of talking about posthumanism. And so in a way, this sort of post-animal is my sort of like comment back to Kerry, that we need to, if we're going to talk about posthumanism, we should talk also about post-animalism. And this is a kind of, maybe sort of a statement along those lines. So I think it is a kind of, I'm interested in the second option, and this being a sort of a statement that we have to move beyond that term and beyond that sort of consideration. But it's also, I think, relates to most of the content of that kind of group, that they really are stretching the boundaries of sort of what constitutes sort of human and animal worlds, as we define them sort of traditionally.
Okay. So I guess you push up pretty quickly to the bounds of Umwelt, or at least Lawrence School's understanding of Umwelt.
Oh yeah.
In terms of what that was for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I really haven't thought about, so you're talking about Oakskill thinking about the human Umwelt as being very particularly human.
We were talking earlier, the Umwelt has a fairly fixed notion of the Umwelt. It's a timeless model of position in which there are kind of things that interact, but there's not correct sort of dynamic that change over time. There's not a particular kind of ecological take, or at least a kind of epigenetic take, as you might understand, how things interact, whether the form matters less than the processes that are driving this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So a kind of a Deleuzian take on Public school would be about change and process, fluidity, ability, which would be very post-animal.
Yeah.
Where it's, you're less concerned about particular forms, but it's about change over time and emerging events.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't quite come up against that specifically. I will say that another sort of point of or reference to this work is Donna Haraway's sort of readings about animal life and what makes an animal, what makes a human. And I used to start a sort of similar talk with this from a quote from Haraway that says, "We are all multiple beings. We are all made up of multiple different sort of animals, like literally, bacteria and RNA and DNA, and these are sort of actually organisms that contribute to us being individual." And so I think that actually really confounds the kind of Umweltian idea in a really interesting way, right? If your sort of individual Umwelt is already the product of multiple other Umwelts, you would have, it gets complicated pretty quickly. So, yeah.
So I guess taking that further, so we're talking about design, which in some ways is premised on the presence of a designer.
Right.
And then, Paul also had this idea about the kind of, everything was a composition, there was some kind of creator, some sort of being that created this thing. He was very anti-Darwin. Where does that leave design? Because who's the designer? Who's the kind of agent of the creation of the piece? And many of these are still quite kind of humans doing the design.
Sure. I think I really think that's the question, and that's what I hope to see, and that's what I look for in all of these projects, is a sense of co-design and sort of collaborative design, and sort of a sense of where the human agency gets reduced. That was kind of the background to my question to Sarah earlier in the day about how do you kind of allow for sort of co-design, co-species, cohabitation, co-designing, kind of intertwined relationships. And I think for me that's a foundational question for the whole practice of architecture and design that goes broader than architecture. And we have to, I think, understand that agency and also how to sort of back away from it and allow for others to participate in the process. So, that question is really at the foundation of all this work, is trying to get to that point. What does that look like? And I'm not sure we're really there yet. So maybe we get to it in some of these projects, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
I just want to tag on to that question, because it strikes me it's really interesting that you're drawn to the spider-fly relationship. Because Bonnet School looked at the Umwelt of many, many different species, right? But the thing that's really interesting for me, which I didn't see until you put it up there, is that it seems to me that what draws you is the web, which is kind of interceding between these two Umwelts as a mediating experience.
Right.
And I don't think I don't think he makes as much of that as he could.
No, yeah. And
so
actually,
that's actually very interesting.
Yeah, I've sort of scoured Oakesville for more on that.
Yeah.
And because he was very interested in sort of understanding the Umwelts and understanding the inputs and the outputs and the relationships between, all the things, all the factors that define an Umwelt. And I'm more interested in how Umwelts meet and touch. I mean, I'm not, I'd like to see how the soap bubbles kind of share their skins, how they sort of, if they don't actually intersect, how do they overlap? I think I love the fact, and it was Tim Morton and maybe Carrie Wolf that kind of, I think, sort of pushed me to look towards that as, as objects, as the kind of, as almost a way to, to say, to speak across the Umwelt in a way. And I think I hope there's potential there. I think it's an interesting investigation, but you're right. Umwelt Oakesville doesn't seem to make as much of it as I think you ought to.
Sarah?
Can I kind of respond / ask a question maybe to your earlier question to me? But
Sure.
I guess I'm interested in what you talked about with the modularity of this system and the notion that after 3 months, if it wasn't working or certain things were being prioritized, that you could reconfigure. Reminds me of Alexander Felsen, who's at Yale. He has an idea called designed experiments. But he's the one who's doing the Million Trees project in New York City. He's one of the people who's involved with that. But the premise that when you finish a project, in a way it's never actually done. When you're engaging with ecology, that is a kind of ongoing reflective process that, like you said, you could reconfigure the project in a way to how the species are in some ways designing. So I know it's a kind of very rudimentary sense, but I think it starts to get to the idea of like co-designing.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of responsiveness that happens, or that's embedded in the initial design that can allow for that adaptation.
Yeah.
And though it may still require the hand of the architect, that there's a kind of ability to learn from how the species are responding to the initial infrastructure or whatever it is that's being put forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these systems are, I mean, I think that we were talking about this a little bit last night, that, you know, kind of modernism and the sort of the economy, the economics, the financial incentives to arrive at one sort of, you know, housing or building solution and then deploy it globally has really sort of set us back, I think, in a lot of ways, where we've sort of forgotten these kind of local traditions about designing very specifically for climates and ecologies and certain kind of animal traits or, you know, behaviors that are, you know, that used to be very, you know, part of traditional housing stock and part of traditional building production. And I think, so what we have to relearn is that are those kind of dynamic relationships that allow for buildings to change and for built environments to be more responsive, to get away from the sort of like the universal solution that a kind of Fordist model of, you know, producing the world, you know, resists. So we have to kind of figure out how to be flexible again. You know, and I think all of this is also, you know, obviously with the background of sort of climate change and the, you know, the specter of no longer having very affordable energy, you know, a lot of this stuff is made possible because there's sort of, you know, cheap energy, cheap gas, cheap land, you know, all that stuff starts to change. We will really be in a sort of predicament about how we sort of actually live. You know, if you can't air condition your glass box anymore, like, it's not a very good place to live. So, you know, in a way, some of this will probably get worked out in time anyway. It's just sort of a matter of like, is it going to be a massive, like, you hit the wall and like you have to sort of suddenly figure out how to solve the problem, or can we kind of sort of more gradually, you know, figure out how to adapt? But
I had a question, but now that we have this discussion, I kind of wanted to make a comment, and that was, and this is for, I guess, all the designers, everyone in the room, but also, you know, I'm very attentive to these legitimate critiques of modernism and modern architecture and whatnot, but I was actually quite encouraged when we had a cube shape, because I think that there's actually a lot of freedom in the cube, and that we get into this, you know, these sorts of design strategies to deploy all this prediction, behavioral analysis, so on, actually a lot of control and maybe less freedom. Flexibility is not always a good thing. You know, I mean, you know, there was all these battles fought for flexibility in the 70s, and now we have insecurity. So,
yeah,
you know, so I'm just, you know, how do we? That was just what I put out there. You know, modern architecture solved a lot of problems.
Sure.
In 1920.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that was the Weimar Constitution, existence minimum. You know, these sorts of things. So I just want to put that out there. You know, stand up for humanism for a minute, you guys. And but in terms of my question for you, that was, and this kind of is a follow up on that. I guess in some ways a follow up. Even though I was thinking about this earlier, and I was wondering if you could. Well, first off, what I really want to say is I'm obviously a big fan of your website and reading it a long time since it was animal architecture and everything. So
thanks.
Really glad to meet you.
Thank you.
And hear you talk about it. And so what I was wondering was if you could talk a little bit about the website more. Your website as a practice, you know, as sort of curatorial practice. Also in relationship to the internet more broadly, what sort of projects, you know, from a design perspective, what sort of design practices are these? Because, you know, again, people were making designs like these in 1920. There's obviously growing out, you know, this tradition is not a Beaux-Arts tradition, you know, but it's a lot of student work.
Yeah.
So those of us who studied architecture, you know, we're familiar with this way of producing, but I'm just sort of interested to hear about how you situate this sort of practice also in relationship to the internet more broadly, there's this whole panorama of sort of blog architecture that is doing something interesting. I'm not sure what. It's sort of between science fiction, critique. Something's going on in there. And I think in the art world, people talk a lot about the impact of the internet on art. And I think in design, maybe not as much. But since you're a figure in that, I was sort of wondering.
Yeah, I'm a figure in that. Wow. Cool. So, I mean, the story, the real honest story with animal architecture, as I was mentioning earlier, just before the talk, is that it was born out of basically a sort of a failed thesis project of my own, and a kind of frustration with what I thought was a serious lack of research and teaching and sort of exploration in this kind of field that I thought was really fruitful. I was, just be completely honest, my thesis project at Rice did not go over very well. And I, in a sort of like dizzying, sleep-deprived kind of state, I sort of grasped the bat for any sort of life raft or support. And honestly, in 2008, 2009, when I was working on this stuff, I couldn't find much. I mean, maybe in Habitat had kind of just started as a website. Jeff Manna was kind of just getting off the ground too with Building Blog. Really, I just kind of said, you know what, I have to start my own thing. Probably 80% of it was trying to find a support group. I mean, it's sort of like commiserate with people who maybe struggled with the same problems that I had with my faculty in the graduate program. And I hope they're watching. So I, that led to the first couple postings on animal architecture. It was really just trying to put the call out, like, is anyone else working on this stuff? And if so, let's kind of talk about it, because I need some help here. To my surprise, it sort of caught on, and we had some early traction with people like Jeff Manna, the Building Blog, Cuptopia, and we got reposted as the best new blog and something or another, and our hits went through the roof, and suddenly we actually had a website. And then it's just kind of been about sort of stoking the fire and kind of keeping the thing alive and sort of managing it. I think internet is an amazing, the idea that you can sort of have this kind of material out there and searchable and accessible is fantastic. I mean, I don't know, I think you're right that the art world deals with this a little bit better, and I think something that we should talk about is why this, the Bio City Lawndale project is happening in an art gallery and not in a museum of natural science or not in a some other kind of cultural institution or a park, for example. Like, this actually is happening in an art gallery, which is a little bizarre. But, I think so there's a kind of openness to experimentation and sort of future thinking that I think exists in other sort of spheres that isn't quite, hasn't quite caught up. I mean, actually, we don't really have, I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a mechanism for thinking these kind of projects very well. Although I think some actors like Joyce or Natalie Jeremijenko have successfully found venues to explore this work. I think sort of short of that, these kind of projects can play out in a sort of virtual realm. And, the internet's a great space for that. There's a lot of, like the VR Eagles project you put on, earlier today. I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of, animal obsession. There's a kind of strange, you see birds showing up in all sorts of architectural renderings. I mean, there's like people just kind of throw in wildlife to sort of sell the project. They're being used as sort of celebrity species in a way, that get kind of postered on renderings to make the project look real or more exciting. So there's a danger to that kind of trade in imagery that happens, I think, a lot. We try our best to see through that, as best we can on the projects. And for the most part, the work that comes to us doesn't really contain that kind of imagery. It's a little bit more honest about trying to engage them.
Well, I guess part of what I was wondering is, to what extent do you feel like these sorts of practices go back to, obviously, architecture students are reading your stuff.
Yeah.
And, it starts to have a circular impact.
So you can ask Sarah that question. She said she downloaded my thesis.
Yeah, so I actually paid for a printed copy.
All right. Awesome.
But yeah, no, it definitely has an impact for sure.
And just also Architected websites like Architected Building Blog and these sorts of things. And sometimes I just think about, the thousands of architecture students in studios late night looking at all this stuff, and it starts to, it seems to be sort of generative somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does carry. I mean, and again, I sort of wish that it had been present when I was starting this work. So yeah, it's impactful.
Ned, thanks so much. I mean, I was thinking when you were talking how much it reminds me of Fairway's nature cultures in many ways, the work you're doing, and it was wonderful to hear about it. And I was glad to hear you explain the post-animal to Jamie, because I was wondering where that came from. But it's such a great example that you just gave, because I worry about how much domestication happens in academia. And in your creative frustration and your resistance, in answer to Marcus's question, there you are, you've created this whole other community that can nourish other people, and it sort of is against the alienation you felt. I mean, it's such a great example.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, it's very impressive.
So, yeah, I mean, it's, it was, the project has been very surprising and so productive in ways that I could never have expected before. So, it's a lot of fun, and obviously it's, I enjoy working on it. So, thank you.
You mean like the domestication of this university and medieval wildness? Is that?
Community wow.
Yeah, right. We're all multiple.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
John?
Kind of a comment. I don't interact with designers and architects very often at all. And I'm kind of taking home, and I got to go home and think about this. A whole new vocabulary, a whole new way of thinking about things and problem solving. But what I'm wondering is, do we have two very different cultures here, the ecologists and the architect designers? And is there a cultural divide? And does that need to be bridged? And I would, kind of comment that it seems to me what I'm hearing in some of these fabulous talks and concepts is a kind of a project-based approach as opposed to what an ecologist would do with a systems-based approach. And how, if there is a gap there, how does that get bridged?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, a good question. And just from a personal perspective, I've landed in a couple situations with, projects that an ecologist or a biologist will say, that just it's bonkers. That will never fly, that won't work, it's the wrong strategy. So I try my best to engage that perspective early in the project and learn those issues up front and try to incorporate it. I do think, the biologists or ecologists that I work with actually tend to resonate quite well with the general sort of vibe of this kind of work. Whether or not they can sort of, see it right away is a different story. But I think I've been lucky to work with people that feel like this kind of effort needs to go forward. I think the best way to bridge that gap is just more conversations, right? It's having more of these kinds of, exactly this kind of forum to have these conversations. And certainly from a sort of urban environment kind of scenario, probably looking at a systems-based approach might make more sense. From an architectural perspective, we tend to focus on a particular problem and try to solve that particular problem in a fairly constrained scale. So I think more work needs to be done, getting those two audiences to relate to each other.
Yeah, and just to follow, I don't know if you should be listening to the biologists and the ecologists. They don't know what they're talking about. So experiment. I mean, what it's about is getting out there and trying things, right?
Yeah.
And introducing things into the world that you did follow up and monitor, and as you were saying, you can go back in a good project and modify.
Right.
That's all good.
Cool.
I'm sure you're aware of this bit, but there's been this great intersection between art, science, I mean, in the UK and here in the US. I mean, we've had lots of programs to sponsor artists in residence in science departments in the UK.
Yeah.
I think in particular over here of, do you know Evan Coatsey and his sort of multi-species salon?
I don't think I do.
Which is a great collection of kind of art science collaborations. I think Natalie Jeremy was involved with
Yeah.
that and a few others where they're kind of scientists who become artists almost.
Yeah.
People who-
Yeah, is it like the tissue culture art guys? And
Some of it is DIY biology, some of it is kind of macroorganisms, some of it is land art. But I'll send you the links, but there's a lot of residents here, and a lot of them have been playing around with the multi-species stuff, and Paraguay was quite involved in
Cool.
some of that
Yeah.
in that way.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of fidelity to the science there in a way, which keeps it slightly more grounded than
Yeah.
some of the...
That's great. I mean, so I was living with a bioengineer when I kind of started with these ideas, and it's kind of taking that idea of engineering life, and he was working on skeletal material, so engineering better bones, people that needed implants in their spine. And so that kind of idea, so he was working on structure, and the parallels to architecture were not too far, and so the idea that you could kind of engineer a sort of living architecture, to me was really beguiling. So that was kind of the very beginning of that project.